It was a discovery that made headlines around the world. The remains of hundreds of Indigenous school children found buried at the site of a government-run boarding school in British Columbia, Canada. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland has promised to investigate similar Indigenous boarding schools in the U.S., including one right here in the Pacific Northwest.
Facing Race contributor Dr. Edmundo Aguilar takes us to the school where Indigenous people and scholars are unearthing a painful past. A warning that some viewers may find the content in this story disturbing.
Unity, perseverance, could do anything to us and we're still going to be here.
Today is the unofficial day of remembrance and recognition for what has happened in the boarding schools.
People here are remembering the stories of lost loved ones.
Makes me grateful today I'm here compared to all the ones that were taken.
Stories of Indigenous children stolen from their families, forced into government-run boarding schools.
I had that haircut too.
Matilda Sampson, a grandmother and community leader, survived one of those schools. We met her here at Fort Spokane, a former Indigenous boarding school.
Everything was taken from me.
Native boarding schools were created by the U.S. and Canadian governments in the late 1800s. The goal, according to the Department of Interior, forcibly relocating the children to schools where their identities, languages, and beliefs were to be forcibly suppressed.
I wasn't used to wearing uniform clothes and not allowed to talk our language or tell our stories.
There are accounts of physical and psychological abuse at these schools. Matilda, a member of a Canadian tribe called the Adam Lake Band, attended Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia in the early 1970s.
They always said there was children buried behind the school.
The tragic hidden truth of some Native American boarding schools.
More than 1,000 bodies found in mass graves at schools in Canada.
Seeing the headlines about the mass graves found at her old boarding school last summer brought Matilda back.
When I first saw it, I was like, I couldn't believe it. It was so heartbreaking. I have a lot of hurt and a lot of hate. I'm angry because I was brought up with a lot of abuse.
Years of alcohol abuse, a coping mechanism to drown out the unsettling memories.
I spent too long in my life hating. That's not who I am today.
Matilda's experience at the school was not one of a kind. There were hundreds of them across North America, including more than 350 Indigenous boarding schools across the United States, mostly government-funded, some run by churches. More than 60,000 Native American children were placed in these schools. That's nearly 83% of all school-aged Indigenous children by the 1920s.
Here we are on the Western Navajo Indian Reservation.
Historic videos show those children side by side with government officials. Stripped of their Native identities, their traditional songs replaced by humiliating ones. One of those schools is still open, Chemawa Indian Training School in Salem, Oregon. It started out in Forest Grove, Oregon, about 40 miles west of Portland. More than 300 Indigenous children were forced to go there. Many, like these Spokane children, never made it out alive.
This is a photograph of students who were en route from Spokane to the Forest Grove Indian School.
Ava Gugamos is an archivist at Pacific University in the city of Forest Grove.
Martha Lott, also known as Maddie Lott, died within about 6 months of this photograph being taken. We think it's probably her.
Over the past 10 years, Ava's research has been locating the remains of Indigenous children like Maddie Lott.
We believe she is buried right about here.
The government relocated Forest Grove to Salem in 1885 and changed the name to Chemawa Indian School. But the mistreatment of the children continued and the number of deaths rose.
We're on sacred ground.
Frederick Lane from the Lactamis tribe attended Chemawa in the 1980s. On Indigenous Peoples Day, Lane came to Chemawa to pay his respects.
They were killed. They were somebody's child. These children were stolen. They lie right here.
For half a century, they lie here, their stories buried along with them. In the 1960s, a bulldozer was sent into the neglected cemetery at Chemawa and wiped out the original headstone plates.
And the plates were put back in an order that they assumed copied an old map.
Sue Ann Reddick, a former Chemawa employee, was distraught about the destruction of the cemetery.
These plates do not necessarily relate to the location of the remains of the children.
So we're hopeful that some of this research can help narrow down what are probably unmarked graves.
Sue Ann and Ava teamed up to convert old cemetery maps and information into a digital database to find unmarked graves.
Based on our list of who died, these ones, we don't know where they were buried. Makes me feel sad and also, I guess, honestly, just a little bit angry that more wasn't done.
Now, families from all over the country can find out who exactly is buried at this cemetery, their tribal affiliation, their burial location, and cause of death.
To stand here and think about that family coming to this school, losing that child while they were there, there aren't any words for it. It's a kind of pain that only parents who have lost their children can understand. You just wish somehow you could comfort somebody, and maybe that is the whole purpose of the work that Ava and I are doing.
We reached out to school officials to ask about Chemawa's history. They referred us to the Bureau of Indian Education, which did not respond.
I guess it's bittersweet with the sad history of Chemawa Indian School.
Lane says the Chemawa of today has evolved into a refuge for young Native Americans.
Chemawa has enlightened my ability to move forward as an Indigenous person.
Today, Indigenous students learn their culture and history here. The cemetery, a reminder of what the children who came before them endured.
They have no voice, but their voice is right here, right now, through the good work that we're trying to do to protect Chemawa Indian School.
I've been sober 30 years now.
Today, Matilda Sampson has found strength in her recovery and healing from a past no longer buried.
I just want to do the best I can with what I have and share it with others. But now I just got to keep moving forward. Can't keep that hate in me, because if I do, then they win.
The Interior Department investigation will identify burial sites like the Chemawa Cemetery and consult with tribes on how to protect them. And the task force will submit a report to Secretary Holland by April 1st about what it found and how to proceed.
You may think you know the story of the first Thanksgiving, but the Face and Race team traveled to Plymouth Rock to meet the descendants of the indigenous tribe that met the Pilgrims 4 centuries ago. As King 5's Natalie Swaby reports, those descendants told us the real story of how Native Americans were erased from the narrative.
Okay. Always on the trail for the truth.
I'm from the Swinomish and Tulalip tribes here in Washington State.
Matika Wilbur is a filmmaker and photographer.
I've been to over 400 tribal communities.
And also a podcaster.
Welcome back to another episode of All My Relations.
Seeking out indigenous stories.
And the most celebrated are portrayals of myths.
Her work involves traveling the country. One of her many stops was in Massachusetts.
When I was in Wampanoag territory, I was deeply taken back by the story of Thanksgiving.
As people sit down this year, what would you hope people would think about?
Thanksgiving, it's a mythical story that is a nice story. It's an easily digestible story. Till we are honest with one another about the first stories of this land and the first people of this land, we can't move forward.
It was a topic discussed in her podcast with scholars that are members of the Wampanoag tribe, Linda Coombs and Paula Peters. We flew to Massachusetts to meet them.
My ancestors went through this horrific experience.
It makes me angry my ancestors were treated so badly, but there's a certain amount of satisfaction that comes from being able to bring the story out.
Peters was photographed by Wilbur.
It's one of the nicer pictures that's ever been taken of me.
The vibrance of Wampanoag culture is undeniable at Peter's store in Mashpee, Massachusetts.
Pasik, knees, nudge. Do you like learning the language? Yeah.
Here, she teaches her children their ancestors' true history.
I think it's really important to look back, especially around this 400th anniversary.
According to historians, in the 17th century, pilgrims broke away from the Church of England for religious reasons. They went to Holland, where they were free to practice their religion. But after about a decade of struggles, including tough economic times, more than 100 men, women, and children boarded the Mayflower. After 66 days at sea, on November 11, 1620, the pilgrims arrived at Cape Cod. They eventually sailed up the coast to where the Wampanoag tribe had lived and settled in. Some books say a year later, the Wampanoag people and pilgrims happily gathered for the first Thanksgiving feast. That's the story you might have heard.
There's just so much bunk around that.
But Peter says that is not even close to what happened.
To play along with it is to bury a lot of real history.
A history you won't find on display here at Plymouth Rock.
Plymouth Rock, it's supposed to symbolize where the pilgrims stepped off the Mayflower when they landed.
This myth around the Plymouth colony that stamped right on the rock, 1620, that's when everything begins. Like that there was nothing that happened before or after.
When it comes to Thanksgiving, Peters and Coombs are trying to separate fact from fiction. And that's what they want here too, at the Mashpee Wampanoag Museum, where you can see reenactments like when the European traders were around a century before the Pilgrims came.
There were ships coming over to this coast here since 1524.
And what happened over the next 100 years set in motion a series of tragic events that would devastate the Wampanoag population.
There was a huge plague that swept through, came from European fishermen.
What they call the Great Dying. There wouldn't even have been this space for the Plymouth Village if all of those people had not been wiped out by a plague.
The backstory also involves violent encounters with Europeans capturing Wampanoag people.
People were sold into slavery in England or in Spain.
So when the Pilgrims arrive, Massasoit, a Wampanoag leader, had to carefully consider what to do.
Massasoit decided to form an alliance with the English.
It was more a strategic decision. It was not something that he was doing really out of the kindness of his heart.
They had weapons that we didn't have, guns, and he's thinking of protecting his people. To say that we were making friends is just, it's ridiculous. And it dishonors history.
And when it comes to the history behind the first Thanksgiving,
it doesn't say the Pilgrims invited the Indians. It just says that Massasoit showed up.
It showed up with 100 warriors. They came because they heard the sound of muskets. But it was certainly not, oh, let's invite our Wampanoag neighbors to our harvest dinner. What happens afterwards? It's all really tragic.
You have to do something with the people that are already there. And if you're not going to kill them outright, which is a method that was used, then you do all these other things like Christianize them, educate them, try to make them like you.
Over time, the Thanksgiving lore has rendered Indigenous people almost invisible.
There's a distinct memory that I have of being a second grader in school. The story was told by the teacher, and one of the other students said, "What happened to all the Indians?" And the teacher said, "Oh, they all died of a plague." And I had to raise my hand and say, no, they didn't, because I'm still here.
I think it's ludicrous, because we've been disregarded and treated like our part in this history doesn't matter, like it or not like it. The history is what it is. And they came and took our land in order to start a colony here, and that's just the truth of it.
It's time to bring out these stories of truth about Indigenous people that are really important.
That is exactly the mission Matika Wilbur is on.
It's very uncomfortable to think about what happened in the settlement of America. I believe that our humanity encourages us to get to know one another. And to me, that's how we break down some of these barriers and we overcome some of these stereotypes, is by being in good relationship with people that look different than us.
That was Natalie Swaby reporting. Wilbur has been working on a project dedicated to photographing over 562 federally recognized tribes here in the U.S. To learn more about it, go to king5.com/facingrace.
Well, for months, a new state law has been in effect banning schools from using inappropriate Native American mascots, but some schools still have not removed them.
King 5's Christine Pei explains why getting rid of these mascots is not just about political correctness. It's essential for many Native American students to minimize cultural trauma.
The most egregious are the Redskins, hands down. Warriors, Braves, Indians.
The totems, the king salmons.
The Chiefs, the Seminoles.
Savages, Redskins. I don't hurt to say a little bit.
And it's not just in professional sports. Images like this are all around our society, even in public schools. And for many Native Americans, that's devastating.
Haumu, ni nania Ivy Pete, nu kuyui tukadu. I am Ivy Pete. I am a Pyramid Lake Paiute.
Ivy Pete is a senior at North Central High School in Spokane, where for decades the school mascot was the Indians. Every day while heading to class, she faced this glass case. Inside, a gift from alumni, a life-size figure representing the school's mascot.
To me, it looked like animals in a zoo. We've heard that a lot.
Ivy says it may seem harmless to other students, but to her, it felt like the school was turning her culture into a mockery.
To see those mannequins in the case that were supposed to represent me, people were telling me I should feel honored by that. I don't feel honored. Why do I have to feel honored by something that doesn't represent me?
Ivy is not alone. Experts have shown, especially for young Native Americans, these images can be damaging to the perception of who they are. Years of research have shown the use of such mascots isn't only insulting, it can bring about cultural trauma.
I am Stephanie Freiberg. I'm a member of the Tulalip tribes, and I'm a professor at the University of Michigan.
Dr. Stephanie Freiberg has researched the profound impact of mascots on Native youth.
Exposing them to Native mascots, it decreased self-esteem, their sense of what their community could achieve, their academic achievement goals.
For Ivy, the mascot did affect her sense of self.
I felt ashamed. I felt like an imposter in my own skin, knowing my own identity, knowing my history, knowing my family.
It's a very romanticized, noble, savage, warrior princess type representation that doesn't really account for our everyday experiences today.
Ivy protested the Indians' mascot by creating this Letterman's jacket featuring a marmot, not a native headdress. She got involved in bringing young voices to the state legislature.
Good morning. I am a junior in high school from Spokane.
Here she is testifying before a virtual House committee hearing.
Today I speak on behalf of the Legislative Youth Advisory Council in support of House Bill 1356.
That's the bill that prohibits the inappropriate use of Native American names, symbols, or images as public school mascots, logos, or team names.
Started talking to policymakers, stakeholder groups, and really threw my full force into this bill.
I am Slinket and Aleut, and I am the only Native American to serve in the entire state legislature.
State Representative Deborah Lekanoff, who represents Whatcom, Skagit, and San Juan counties, is one of the bill's sponsors.
I really believe that we have an opportunity here to re-identify who we are as humans. We're not a character, and we're not a cartoon.
This spring, Governor Jay Inslee signed the bill into law.
This entire mascot debate has been solely and entirely fueled by the fire of our ancestors, by those who came before us, and so I stand on their shoulders.
My name is Willie Frank III. My Indian name is Kolashkid.
Willie Frank is chairman of the Nisqually Indian tribe. He's working with schools in Thurston County to help them remove offensive mascots.
We have a picture of our beautiful Mount Rainier.
Willie took us to the Wahilut Indian School near Olympia to show us how schools can feature Native symbols accurately and respectfully.
It's done the right way.
The school includes a mural telling the story of the Nisqually River.
And in our language, Tequotma is what my grandfather called our mountain. I think it was to make sure that we teach our kids who they are. And when you walk into this school, you feel there's something here that this isn't a joke, this isn't a cartoon.
Today, Ivy can walk through her school a little more comfortably. The glass case is gone, this headdress gone too. And the North Central High Indians are now the Wolf Pack.
We're the Wolf Pack now, which is exciting. We're making all these changes. I get to compete in track this year with a new uniform that no longer feels like a denigration to my culture, which is so cool.
Not all schools have made progress like Ivy's. The deadline to do so is fast approaching on December 31st. Schools that don't comply could lose state funding and the important opportunity to create a new path for Native American students.
Just like House Bill 1356 is not an end-all be-all, it's a invitation to conversation, an invitation to reparative justice.
They have to be strong in knowing who they are, know that they matter, or else we're going to continue down this road of historical trauma. And we as the First Americans can no longer take that on. We have to grow in a better way.
OSPI, the state's public school system, is providing grants for schools to pay for changing old mascots. It's unclear how many Washington schools have made a decision on this yet, but OSPI says based on what it has seen so far, it appears most schools will meet that December 31st deadline. State Representative Lanikoff is working on an amendment to extend the deadline and add funding for schools to implement the law. If you have a story idea and you'd like Facing Race to follow up on it, just send it to our team. Send an email to race@king5.com.
Well, they call themselves the Nooksack 306. It's a name given to members of the Nooksack Indian tribe based in Whatcom County. Tribal leadership claimed the 306 don't belong and should not be reaping the benefits.
It's a fight that escalated last week when the United Nations demanded a halt to what they call forced evictions. As Sebastian Robertson reports, the internal tribal battles bringing unprecedented outside intervention.
Some 30 minutes northeast of Bellingham, in a neighborhood cut out of dense forest, you'll find a group of Nooksack people fighting with all they have to keep their namesake and their homes.
That's where we're all going to have to stand up, and we're not moving. I don't know what we have to do to, it's going to get ugly if they do that.
Tribal leadership has disenrolled more than 300 members. They've been kicked out. Inside the home of Norma and Eugene Ulrich, a gathering of the now former Nooksack members that remain in tribal housing.
They've pitted us against each other. It's become an us and them thing.
In 2013, the Tribal Council moved to disenroll the Nooksack 306. They claim that a Canadian ancestor from the 19th century was an illegal Nooksack. Therefore, her relatives are eligible to enroll in the tribe.
Yeah.
Santana Rabang was a teenager when the process started nearly a decade ago.
But yet they're using the fact that our ancestral name wasn't listed on a colonial document from 1942. That's the main excuse that they're using, that we're not Indigenous.
Rabang has lost her tribal benefits, and so have the elders. Back at the dinner table, Aldridge and her husband face eviction.
It's like every year I say, do I put up a tree? Do I decorate? Or, do I start packing? It's just going through my mind all the time. Like, what do we do?
Nationally, thousands of tribal members have been banished over so-called lineage concerns. But it's not that simple. Other tribes are accused of ousting members in order to maximize profits. And that's what some are accusing the Nooksack tribal leadership of doing in this case.
To say if there are 1,000 of us and we get rid of 500 of us and 500 are left, the 500 remaining will now get twice more than they had before the other 500 were exiled. That's basically the sick math that goes into disenrollment. But it's an epidemic across the country.
A crisis that has led these tribal members to do something Indigenous people rarely do: turn to the federal government for help and allow our cameras to document their struggle.
Having to look outside of this to get people to help is really difficult.
Gabe Galanda is an Indigenous rights lawyer who's representing the 306.
The damage here is irreparable. I'm not convinced this tribe will ever be the same or will ever be a tribe again.
Galanda has called on the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Biden administration, and recently drew the attention of the United Nations Human Rights Council. Just last week, the UN called on the United States to halt what they call imminent forced evictions of former Nooksack Indigenous tribe members. Nooksack leadership responding, calling the UN investigation riddled with misinformation, claim that only 8 disenrolled members are facing eviction, and double down on their claim that the exiled members do not belong.
The 306 don't belong. There's nobody who is Nooksack who belongs. That's what the powers that be are flirting with.
The powers that be are the Nooksack Tribal Council. At the top, Chairman Ross Klein Sr.
Why would
we reward fraud or even consider fraud to be historic.
Klein claims the 306 are members of a Canadian band, or tribe as we say in the U.S., are not Nooksack, and sees no middle ground.
I repeat, not members of the Nooksack Indian tribe. Never have been, never will be.
And these pictures show that Klein is serious. Before the new year, armed tribal police are caught on camera serving eviction notices.
This is home. This is her family, where she was born. And then for them to try to take that away from her, it hurts.
That really hurts, you know. We're going to fight till the end. It hurts.
They can say whatever they want. It's their perception. I know who I am. They can't take that away.
That was Sebastian Robertson reporting. If you have a story you'd like us to follow in our Facing Race unit, email us at race@king5.com.
It is a billion-dollar industry built on ripping off Native American art. Just in December, 2 Seattle men were charged with pretending to be Native American carvers by selling goods at Pike Place Market. Selling fake Native American art is a federal crime.
King 5's Facing Race reporter PJ Randawa explains why many say a law meant to protect Indigenous artists isn't working.
Our cedar itself, when it's ready to carve, it will give itself to us.
In her Shelton studio, art is a language that speaks to Andrea Wilbur-Saigo.
It's always been told we didn't have a written language, but this is it.
Each nudge, each nick, a dialect.
It's all of our history, art in every one of those art pieces.
From fashion runways to fleece blankets, for decades, corporate America has plastered Native American art and design all over their products. But consumers may not know that very little of that mass-produced work is done by real Native artists, like Andrea.
I've been beat out by quite a few non-Native artists for good jobs. I would have to say they get better prices than we do.
In 1990, Congress created the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. Under the law, if you're representing or selling your work as Native and it's not, you're committing a federal crime. Instead, you have to be honest and say the work is Native inspired or Native style.
This is a law that does not have the teeth that it should have to protect the legitimate Indian arts and crafts industry.
Seattle-based Indigenous rights lawyer Gabe Galinda says in 2022, the act is outdated and lacks accountability. What enforcement is in the act?
It appears that's what's missing, but there has to be some process by which the question is being asked. Are you Indigenous? Is your art Indigenous? And if you say you are and you say it is, can you please show us the proof?
The penalties for misrepresenting Native art are steep, a $250,000 fine and up to 5 years in prison. But it's not enough to stop everyone. That's Louis Anthony Rath, aka Tony Rath on Instagram, creating work federal investigators say he illegally passed off as authentic at places like Pike Place Market. Prosecutors have charged him with violating the Indian Arts and Crafts Act.
These acts operate to displace Indigenous artists from their craft, their livelihood, and from the economy that they deserve to have a place in.
Ripping off Native American artwork is a multi-million-dollar business. Take a look at some of these knockoffs confiscated by investigators. In 2016, law enforcement seizures in New Mexico and California uncovered $35 million in counterfeit art. And it's a crime that has an international reach. The U.S. Department of Justice recently charged 8 people with smuggling in this jewelry that appeared to be Native American. But the items were actually knockoffs smuggled in from the Philippines. What type of person does that? Knowingly misrepresents themselves, a whole cultural identity to sell art. Who does that?
I think people think it's an easy way just to make some money. This whole store is about Native people who are inspired and are creating this beautiful art.
The CEO of the company 8th Generation, Colleen Echohawk, says she didn't know it, but even here at a shop dedicated to Native American art, they sold a counterfeit item. So we did find one of the men that was charged with violating the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. He did sell here several years ago. We found on his Instagram page, he mentioned this store. Were you aware of that?
I was made aware of that. And it was because of that instance that we started collecting tribal identification and asked people to show us, their enrollment cards in their tribe so that we can ensure that the art that we are putting out there is going to go back to the Native community and see prosperity for Native people and Native artists.
But pretty much until this is done, this is where I live, is out here in the shop.
Back in Andrea Wilbur-Saigo's Shelton studio, she says there's another problem with the law.
I will change this federal law in my lifetime.
If she or any other Native artist allows a non-Native person to help with the creation, under current law, that too has to be labeled Native style or inspired work. Andrea says she could really use help from her mother, who's also a carver. But since her mother is not Native, that's not possible.
Now you're telling me I have to market my work the same as any other non-Native person. We should be able to say it's Native, it's ours. It's cultural, it's spiritual, it comes from the roots that we were all born from, and nobody can clip those roots. The only thing this law does is harm Native people from succeeding.
In a few weeks, Andrea's biggest dream, her latest work, will find a permanent place in downtown Seattle.
It's Grandmother Frog. She's 21 feet.
A welcome figure that authentically speaks the unique language of this land.
It's our written history, our future, and our present. Without it, we lose a big part of our soul on where we've came from and where we're going. Yep, we haven't went anywhere. We're not going anywhere.
If you're in the market for Native American artwork, ask for proof that the piece was created by a Native artist. That could include things like the artist's biography or information about their tribal affiliation. And remember, watch out for words like Native inspired or Native style. Those pieces could be created by anyone. For Facing Race, I'm PJ Randhawa.
In an effort to combat the plague of missing and murdered Indigenous people, Native American communities often put together a safety system to protect themselves. It's called the Plan.
Tonight, in a King 5 Facing Race special report, PJ Randhawa explains how Native American families are having this important conversation for their own survival.
In the Echo Hawk home,
I personally believe in like a cultural and spiritual call to doing this kind of art.
Each stitch.
I did these handprints in the color of the Native medicine wheel.
Each shade.
Red is the color of prayer.
Comes with a story.
It's also a symbol of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls movement.
And sometimes a reminder about the plan.
These kids, along with my own, they know that if their aunties or their mom ever went missing, that we would never have left them on purpose.
It's a plan Abigail Echohawk of the Seattle Indian Health Board says every Native woman she knows has had to make, what her family should do if she were to disappear.
They would need to make sure that somebody looked for us. For my children, they know that my handprints are on the dresses. They know that they would be able to take my fingerprints to the police. Do you ever remember not knowing about this?
No. We can be in danger. People get lost by not telling people where they are and not being careful. They don't come home and you don't get to be with your family anymore.
Here in Washington, Indigenous people are going missing or being murdered at the second highest rate in the country. Seattle itself ranks as the city with the highest number of cases nationwide. According to the Seattle Indian Health Board, compared to white women, Indigenous women in Washington are 4 times more likely to go missing. Right now, State Patrol records show 126 Indigenous people in the state who aren't accounted for.
Research has shown us that the primary perpetrator of the acts of violence against Indigenous women and girls are white men, predominantly white men who come onto reservations or target Indigenous women within urban settings.
With fewer resources, Native American families are forced to take matters into their own hands and form plans for their loved ones.
I've actually posted something on Facebook. If I ever go missing, know that I didn't do it on purpose. Come look for me. I love my family and friends. I wouldn't just disappear.
Nana Bluen has spent the past 2 years looking for her own sister, 39-year-old Mary Johnson. Mary was last seen on the Tulalip Reservation on Thanksgiving 2020.
We don't want her flame to go out, so we're trying everything we can to keep her name and face out there.
Mary's sisters, Nona and Jerry, believe she may have been a victim of human trafficking.
Yeah, what do you tell your kids about where she is?
I just say, Aunt Mary's trying to find her way home. And our eldest daughter, she goes like this all the time. You know, and she's like, Mom, can we email the chief and ask where she is? Mom, why aren't they looking for her? You know, how come she's not home yet? She can't be that lost. And I don't want to tell them that she's missing. So that's what I tell them.
Fire Trail Road. This is the road what Mary was seen walking on the day she went missing. We believe that she trusted somebody, got in a vehicle, and has never been seen since.
Tulalip Police Chief Chris Sutter sees Mary's case as a continuation of what's been happening to Indigenous people in America for centuries.
Historically, the wrongs that have been committed, including abductions and murders and rapes and all forms of sexual assaults and other types of abuses, have gone unpunished and unprosecuted. This has been perpetuated for centuries.
And it's because of that history, Chief Sutter has talked to his own children about the plan.
My children have all heard Dad preach to them, be aware of their surroundings and their situation, and don't trust people.
I wanted to do this in honor of the families.
Back in the Echo Hawk home.
Do you guys know that? We would never leave you.
Mm-hmm. Abigail hopes future generations won't need to prepare for their own abductions or murder by having a plan.
Having a plan is part of the hopelessness that's experienced by our communities. It's not something any of us should have to do.
Until then, Abigail creates hope from unlikely sources, like these flowers on her latest art piece.
And really thinking about every single person as a blossom, as beloved life.
When the Seattle Indian Health Board asked for PPE during the pandemic, the federal government sent them these body bags instead.
How many body bags do you have?
Got like 22 left.
22 body bags?
Now Abigail uses them to create art that highlights the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. One of her works made from these body bags has even been featured in Vogue.
My artwork is a form of healing.
She's also now using them to keep the traditions of her culture alive for the next generation.
It's cool because most people are not able to be a part of the culture.
The thing I love about it is that for these kids, this is just who they are. It's going to be pretty.
Creating hope and beauty from darkness.
There's hope on healing the past so that we have full healing for our community so their children's children don't experience the same things that I did, that they did, where something like this is never out of a body bag again. I refuse to let the hopelessness be all the conversation.
If you have information on Mary Johnson's case or any other missing Indigenous person case, contact the Seattle FBI office. We have a full list of those missing, along with information on how you can pass along tips on our website, king5.com. For Facing Race, I'm PJ Randhawa.
Well, days of searching have paid off for the family of a missing Indigenous woman. Tonight, she is in the hospital getting the treatment that her family says she desperately needs.
So many other families are facing the same struggle. Seattle has the highest number of missing and murdered Indigenous people of any city in the country. Tonight, Facing Race reporter PJ Randhawa takes you inside the search and shows us the obstacles her family faced.
Just want to say prayers. We go into there.
The scent of burning sage carries a prayer for the Bolthill family.
As we start this day, we just ask Creator to help us to find Shalina.
For 4 days, the search for 31-year-old Shalina May Bolthill,
if she's in here, we want her to see you,
has led her family and advocates to several homeless encampments.
You guys here today?
I seen her all the time.
Yeah.
The Idaho native moved to Seattle with a boyfriend in 2017 and soon lost touch with her family.
I think that she got into the drug scene. The last couple messages she had left her dad were just absolutely unbelievable. They didn't make any sense. About a year ago, he stopped getting any messages, any calls.
Wednesday, the family got their first glimpse of Shalina after more than 5 years.
She got pockmarks all over her face.
She screamed and said, "This lady's crazy, help." But then, I don't know, a few seconds later, she turned around and told me she loved me.
Watch out for needles.
The unhoused that live here call this area near the I-5 and I-90 interchange the jungle. It's one of Seattle's long-standing encampments.
Can you guys wait right here? And you all recognize Bree?
Roxanne White, founder of the grassroots organization Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, People, and Families.
That's what they're saying, King Street, and then over there by Yesler again.
Has a unique understanding of what Shalina and her family are up against.
I used to be homeless, and I'm a trafficking survivor, and I was out on the streets, and I know the kind of things that happen out here, and I know firsthand just what I survived, and I can't imagine, and then I can, which breaks my heart to know that she's walking around with no shoes and that she never wears shoes.
Seattle police tell us Shalina is not considered missing. In an email, police confirm they've had prior contacts with Shalina over the years and even made a past referral for evaluation.
This child, this woman, this young lady is incapable of even asking for help. So that leaves the family to bear this burden on their own. The heartbreaking thing is who do we call? I mean, there's nobody to call. There's nobody to come aid us. There's gaps in this system. Do you know where she might be right now?
She's around.
She's around? Is she in this camp right now?
Last time I seen her was on that road.
As close as the searchers get, Shalina remains just out of reach, much like the resources they desperately need to get her home. Last year, an out-of-state tribal court granted Shalina's mother guardianship over her so she could be committed for treatment. However, an Indigenous rights lawyer tells us it's unlikely the tribal order is enforceable in Washington.
I've done everything in a mother's power to save my child, and I've fought against the system now for a while, which means my words mean nothing to them, and that's not okay. It's not okay.
A plea for help that Roxanne, a once missing Indigenous woman herself, hopes to answer.
I think it's so important that we try to come in and do what we can so that she doesn't become one of our MMIW that never makes it home. This is why I survived everything. This is why I survived. It was to help other families.
This is roughly the 6th search Roxanne has organized as part of her work with the families of missing and murdered Indigenous people. She says she desperately needs volunteers and donations to continue to raise awareness around this ongoing crisis. To find out how you can help, go to our website, king5.com. For Facing Race, I'm PJ Randhawa.
Pike Place Business is going viral for its creative approach to explaining cultural appropriation. Facing Race reporter PJ Randhawa reveals how the native lifestyle brand 8th Generation is reaching millions.
The sale of fake Native American art has been a problem in Washington and here at Pike Place Market. Late last year, 2 Western Washington artists were charged with selling counterfeit art, some of it here at the market. Now, one business here is using TikTok as a way to educate consumers about how to tell the real from the fake.
Cultural appreciation is fine.
At 8th Generation, conversations about cultural appropriation are a lot lighter than you may expect.
This is a work of art. This is bullshit. This is a work of art. This is bullshit.
We're having great fun educating people about being that ethical consumer.
CEO Colleen Echohawk says the store's TikTok videos run the gamut from funny to serious.
When you profit off of elements from a culture that is not yours, whether that's economically or socially, that's cultural appropriation.
But always educational at heart.
We've done some TikToks where we have just shown people, like, hey, this is a piece of native art or jewelry, and we want you to wear it, and you should wear it, and you shouldn't be afraid of cultural appropriation when you buy it from an authentic native artist. You're born for the camera, Gianni.
These quick videos made by staff at the native-owned business have found a huge audience on TikTok, surpassing more than 1 million views.
What we're seeing on TikTok, the people that are watching us over and over and over again, and our TikToks are going super viral, is because it's a group of folks who want to be educated about what they're buying. They want to make ethical choices. And so we are the perfect place if you want to be making an ethical choice and being a conscious consumer.
EchoHawk says 8th Generation has strict protocol to ensure everything for sale here is made by a native artist.
You can go all around the store and you'll see bios of our artists, because that is the way you can be sure that that artist is asking you to please support the native community, support their business, support native entrepreneurship. I believe that native art is part of the way that we're going to heal as a community.
If you come across a piece of native artwork or design that you're interested in buying, you may want to ask about the artist to verify that the piece is authentic. One term to look out for is native inspired. Those pieces can be made by anyone. At Pike Place Market for Facing Race, I'm PJ Randhawa.
Seattle police are updating their procedures in response to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people in Washington state.
The changes come after the Seattle City Council passed a 2019 initiative to improve data collection in cases which involve Indigenous victims.
Facing Race reporter PJ Randhawa joining us live to explain why advocates say racial misclassification hid the full scope of this crisis. PJ?
Well, a 2018 study says that Seattle has the highest number of missing and murdered Indigenous people of the 71 cities surveyed. But now advocates say Seattle is leading the nation, one of the first cities to address this crisis by changing the way that we report and respond to these cases.
There were certain things that I was very concerned about.
Thursday, the Seattle City Council received an update on a 5-year project to improve racial misclassifications in the Seattle Police Department's data reporting. City leaders say the project is critical to expose the full scope of the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people in our area. A 2018 study by the Urban Indian Health Institute found that of the 506 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women reported nationwide, 153 of them were not entered into a law enforcement database at all. Researchers also point out roughly 71% of the U.S. Native population live in urban areas like Seattle, so communication between tribes and municipal police in these cases is vital.
Happy to be here to give a brief update on some of the work that we have been doing.
In response, SPD recently hired an MMIWP data analyst, and the department is in the process of reviewing existing gaps in their reporting processes. Advocates say it's critical work that will give voice to the families of those missing and murdered.
Data inevitably helps us, I hate to say it this way, but really prove our stories, because that's what Western systems are dependent upon. And once those stories have been proven, then resources are allocated and a response is allocated and prioritization is allocated, and inevitably we get what we need to have real solutions put in place. Do I like dealing with that system? No. I wish our stories were enough. I wish our tears were enough.
Some of the recommendations made to SPD include having first responders ask victims and their families to self-identify their race and tribal affiliations. Now, the eventual goal of all of this is to have a process in place for collecting this data that can be replicated in other cities around the country. In Seattle, for Facing Race, I'm PJ Randhawa.
In the 1960s and 70s, Washington State was selling one of its greatest treasures for just a few $100. Orcas were hunted and captured, sent to aquariums and amusement parks around the world. But one of those captured orcas has died.
Facing Race reporter PJ Randhawa shares why members of the Lummi Nation have mobilized to fight for one's return.
Welcome. We're
are the Lactamish people.
On the shore of the Salish Sea.
These are the native waters of Quethalmachan, orcas.
Members of the Lummi Nation and others pray for the return of someone they consider family. A southern resident orca that was captured from these waters more than 50 years ago.
This is her home, not in Miami, the cement tank. That's not where she belongs. We ache for our relative. So it was important today to gather to send prayers to Scully Chucktanut to let her know we're coming for her.
The Lactamish people call her Scully Chucktanut. But here in Miami, where she's been held in captivity for the last 50 years, she's Lolita. She's legal property of the Miami Seaquarium.
When you are close to her, you can feel the sadness that she's just hanging on. It is just taking a lot longer than we'd ever hoped.
Scully Chucktanut's story begins in 1970, around the time King 5 began investigating orca captures in Puget Sound.
Had aircraft flying over the San Juans to spot them, boats with explosives to separate the adults from the babies.
It was during one of these captures, Scully Chucktanut was violently taken from her family in Washington's Penn Cove. She was just 4 years old.
They only wanted the babies. She is the longest living orca in captivity. When she was brought to a pen on the dock by the harbor, she was crying. Her mother was crying. People around Penn Cove, the older people can still hear the cries, the screams.
The whole capture itself, how traumatizing would that have been?
Terribly traumatic. Pain on the side of their heads when those bombs are going off.
Howard Garrett, co-founder of the Orca Network, showed us photos from some of those whale captures in the early 70s.
The older females would gather around the young ones and try to protect them. They knew what was happening.
Since her capture, Scully Chucktanut has lived mostly alone here at the Miami Seaquarium.
It's shallow. There's nowhere in her tank that's deep enough that she can dive.
Ellie Kinley and Raynell Morris are Lummi tribe members who have visited Scully Chucktanut in Miami.
You know you're not alone.
You'll see that there's 2 umbrellas for the trainers that are working with her, but yet there's no shade for her.
According to a 2021 inspection report, she's fed poor quality rotten food. The water in her tank is dirty, and her trainers disregarded veterinary instructions to make her perform despite injuries.
This is an extreme case of torture and abuse. She's been treated very, very badly by a lot of the staff.
In March, the Dolphin Company purchased the Miami Seaquarium. As a condition of the sale, the company had to retire Scully Chucktanut. For now, she remains in Miami. The company did not return our request for comment.
She is now gone from the corporate books from an asset to a liability. So that's a huge incentive for them to come to the table and want to partner with us.
Scully Chucktanut's advocates are working to get an independent veterinarian to assess her condition and determine whether she could safely make the 3,000-mile journey back home.
It's been done since the 1960s. Hundreds of times orcas have been transported by plane.
First, Scully Chucktanut would be coaxed into a custom-made stretcher and lifted out of her Miami aquarium with a crane. The 20-foot, 7,000-pound orca would then be lowered into a small container not much bigger than herself, filled with ice water to prevent overheating. From there, she'll be loaded onto a cargo plane for a 6-hour trip to the Bellingham airport. Next, onto a barge, which will transport her to her ancestral waters in the Salish Sea. Her new home will look very different than the cement aquarium she's spent the last half-century in. The plan, created in collaboration with wildlife researchers and marine mammal veterinarians, calls for a netted underwater pen, 250 feet long, 100 feet wide, and 30 feet deep in fresh ocean water.
The scent of the cedar brings the salmon home. And that scent travels across the water to her. She's home. It's calling her home, like it calls the salmon home.
Here at home and in Miami, a special call from her family.
And when we went to Miami in 2020, we brought our cedar with us to put it in to the water outside of her tank. So Skelly Chucktonut would smell that cedar. Skelly Chucktonut! And know that's home. Skelly Chucktonut! She's 56. She has 37 plus beautiful years left of her life. When she comes home, she'll feel comforted. Her struggle's over. I can see it.
On the horizon, advocates hope for a reunion. A half century in the making.
This story is not over. Facing Race will monitor the situation and bring you updates. And for more information, just text the word ORCA to 206-448-4545. For months, our Facing Race team has been looking into why Washington State and Seattle specifically have some of the highest numbers of missing Indigenous people in the country. It's a crisis Washington State will now be the first to address with a new statewide alert system.
PJ Randall explains how it works and how it could help.
Right now, there are 128 reports of missing Indigenous people in Washington, but advocates and investigators say there are likely more cases that haven't been reported. Part of the problem is there hasn't been much help or attention. The hope is this new alert system will change that.
On your phone and on the road, starting July 1st, Washingtonians will start seeing missing persons alerts specifically about Indigenous people. It's called the Missing Indigenous Person Alert, or MIPA. While Indigenous people make up less than 2% of Washington's population, studies show Indigenous women are 4 times more likely to go missing than white women and face murder rates more than 10 times the national average.
We just want to be heard. We want to know that our lives matter, and we want to be found. And that's what this alert system does at the end of the day.
Representative Deborah Lakanoff, the only Indigenous woman in Washington's House of Representatives, says the alert will streamline tribal and local police jurisdiction issues, which have historically hampered missing persons investigations.
No, I'm not so alone that I won't sit in my house and wonder why no one's helping me find my daughter and why there's no police. They will contact the local police, the state police, and now the broadcast will go out in my local area.
Here's how it works. When a person is reported missing to tribal or local police, the investigator on the case now has the option to ask Washington State Patrol to issue an alert.
How do you decide who gets an alert?
Is it an imminent danger situation, and would activation of that alert assist in the recovery? As law enforcement, we kind of have to make that decision. Sometimes it's a tough decision. So this is an example of what the flyer is going to look like.
Once activated, you could see the MIPA alert on highway signs, social media, and on WSP's Twitter page.
When we put these flyers together, we'll be adding photos of the missing person and any associated vehicles.
The MIPA alerts won't be as visible as Amber alerts, but that could change by the end of the year.
Future technology will allow us to geographically target the alerts.
Representative Lakanoff says the MIPA alert model could soon be replicated in Canada and across the U.S.
We're getting responses from the attorney generals across the state, across all the states.
For those still searching for missing loved ones, like the family of Mary Johnson, the alert is welcome news that they say could have made all the difference.
Do you think something like that would have helped?
If this was back when Mary first was reported missing, of course, I believe she probably would have been found.
The alert system does something very simple for us as Native American women. It takes the hand away from the mouth so you can hear the unheard screams.
King 5 will be broadcasting those MIPA alerts. It's part of our commitment to help end the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people in our state. To sign up for the alert, text the word ALERT to 206-448-4545 and we'll send you a link. For Facing Race, I'm PJ Randhawa.